Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz composer, percussionist, visual artist, and educator Gerry Hemingway. He is an immensely talented and interesting cat living in Switzerland these days, and he's been there for the last 6 years. His life began in New Haven, Connecticut, and took some very cool turns after meeting and learning and looking up to Anthony Davis, Leo Smith, and the great Anthony Braxton. He actually composed for the Kansas City Symphony back in 1993 and learned quite a bit from that experience. Gerry has a richly interesting jazz bio and music journey, and he's very compassionate about retelling it. So please dig this interview, my friends.
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm wonderful, man. Hey, thank you for taking some time out to talk with me today.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to go ahead and start off right here. I know you're pretty detailed on your website about what's going on in your world, but I always like to hear kind of a verbal snapshot of what's been going on in your life lately.
For the last 6 years, I've lived in Switzerland, in the town of Luzern, which is in the central part of Switzerland, or the German part. I have been enjoying and slowly developing in lots of different ways, engaged in a job that I was invited to do here at the Hochschule Luzern, which is Hochschule in German means high school, but it means instead, in fact, the equivalent in American terms to college or even graduate school, as it tends to do a mixture of bachelor and master level education. The system here in Europe is a little bit different than it is in the States, but there's an attempt to try to make the two systems fairly much in alignment. They call the system here the Bologna system, and it's modeled after the Oxford University, which is more or less what the U.S. universities use for accreditation in terms of all the work you do. At any rate, I've been here all this time, and over time, my work as an educator has blossomed into a lot of different departments. I was ostensibly brought here to teach the drums, but now I teach composition, I teach improvisation, I teach electronic music, I teach songwriting. I do a lot of things that reflect the broad scope of interest that I am. And so, and I'm also very involved in, I just came from a meeting that was regarding future plannings for the school, and so I'm involved in enjoying it, and it's a good experience, good faculty, very interesting school. So it's a big part of my life. It is it's the central thing that holds me here in Europe now. But I am performing a lot, and then the funny and interesting thing is that despite having such a heavy responsibility with this job, I actually have never been performing more often than now. Maybe the only period earlier in my career where I could maybe say that wasn't true was when more in the 80s, when the vitality of the European scene was very intense. So I was on like 9-week tours and so forth. But that kind of situation doesn't exist anymore. So I am, however, performing a great deal. And tomorrow I take off to Beirut, Lebanon, to perform with the Frank Krakowski Quartet. Frank is somebody who I originally met via the Klaus Koenig Orchestra, and Frank is an incredible saxophonist, bass clarinetist, and clarinetist. And his quartet is quite an outstanding group. It also contains a trombonist who I've had a long association with, who's based and is from the Netherlands. His name is Walter Wirbos. And as well, Dieter Manderscheid is the bassist. This group has existed for quite a long time. We've actually produced, I think by now, 5 or 6 different CDs. And a very wonderful band, great chemistry. It actually originally started as a trio without the trombonist. Beautiful group. Very much enjoyed playing with these guys. And it's my first time in Lebanon, which I have to admit that I'm a slightly nerve-wracked by going to such a place so close to Syria and so close to very, very dire events in the world. But one must take a little risk in life and understand what's going on by being somewhat near it and somewhat close to it. And I think the situation is, in fact, perfectly safe and will be okay, so I'm not worried about it really. But it's for me a new experience, and so I'm looking forward to that. And it's one of the great things about being a musician is having the opportunity to experience new things.
Well, speaking of new experiences, that has to be you've been there for 6 years in Switzerland. How has it been to kind of adopt a new way of life in Europe and kind of, not being in America for this long?
For me, it works. I wouldn't say that for some of my fellow colleagues who've thought about or talked about perhaps expatriating to another country or to Europe. It's not for everybody, let's put it that way. My experience is fairly positive. The challenge that I would face and anybody would face in going into a different culture is primarily surrounding language. In this country, language is a very fertile topic. After all, there are 4 languages in the country, and most people I run into speak a good deal of them, 2 or 3 of them, if not more. So in this country, where I'm living, German is the main language, the central language, but there's also what's known as dialect. Dialect or dialect is the local language, and there are many such local languages spread throughout the country, particularly in the German part, but also in the French part. But everybody I meet here can speak this so-called High German or regular German, and they can speak dialect, of course, but in different ways, and they have sometimes even a hard time understanding each other depending on how far away they are from each other, wherever they grew up. You can actually grow up, you can believe this, you can grow up about 10, 15 miles from each other and speak. The local dialects will not be necessarily understood by each other. In other words, you can be living that close together and actually speaking almost what amounts to a completely different language, just 15 miles down the road.
Wow.
It's pretty wild.
The
language is really, like I said, it's a fertile topic here, and it's very interesting. And for me, I'm rather enjoying the challenge of trying to master, first of all, German, which is something I've always wanted to do, but never really had the time or patience or whatever, or just the drive or the will to do. And now I'm kind of forced to do it, and I appreciate that I'm forced to do it, and I'm working hard on it. It's a very challenging language. The more I understand it, the more I learn it, the more I speak it, the more I'm functioning in it, and reading it, writing it, listening to it, and more or less able to deal with it. The more I enjoy living here, because it's really a natural thing that one wants to speak the language of where you are. Now, that's not true of a lot of Americans who live in Switzerland. A lot of Americans who live in Switzerland never bother to learn the language and continue to speak English all the time, because everybody here speaks English. It's also one of the things that makes it hard about learning German, is because whenever I speak to anybody, it's very easy to switch to English. So you don't really feel, you could get by without ever really confronting language and going deeper into the culture. But for me, that's not the way I want to live. I'm interested in where I'm living and learning from where I'm living. And that's one thing. And a lot of people wonder if I really miss the States. And of course, I go back quite often. My son lives in New York City, and I'm back in the city fairly often, 3, 4, or 5 times a year for a few days or a week at a time. I'm slightly restricted as to how long I can be in the States due to residency laws, tax laws, basically. I can only be in the States for up to 35 days, or else I run into a tax problem. But otherwise, I'm basically, slowly becoming more and more adjusted to life here and enjoying it.
So you grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, started playing the drums as a kid, and by 17 you were working professionally. What was it about your early life that lent you this love of not only jazz but music?
Well, that's a good question. I think that I myself also do a lot of interviewing, and I'm very curious why people got in the game in the first place, and particularly why they stayed in it, why they continue, sometimes against many odds and against all rational reasoning, to stay in a profession that's pretty difficult to make a comfortable life in, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So that's what I really take your question to be. And I would say that what got me in, to start there, as far as I did start when I was around 10 years old playing the instrument, that meant that that was 1965, basically. And in the 60s, that was a very rich period of musical. I was surrounded basically by a very vibrant musical culture that became more or less some mixture of the British invasion and the San Francisco psychedelic scene, and all these things were very exciting times in music. And I saw all of that stuff. I saw it all live. I went constantly to concerts. My parents were kind of, well, loose or very forgiving, or I don't know what, but they allowed me to go to these concerts quite often. Even when I was 11 or 12 years old, I was showing up at Jimi Hendrix concerts. And so this established in me a passionate relationship to music, first as a listener, but I kind of noticed that I kept going closer and closer to the stage, and I guess that was an indicator that I had some feeling for wanting to be on the thing. So, and I was playing the drums, and of course I slowly began to create a social world out of music and found people to play with. But this took time. I didn't really get to that until I was more like 15 or so, or 14 or 15. And then I was in a kind of a country band, and I'm sort of doing rock and blues jams and things of this nature. And at that time, I was in a boarding school in New Jersey, and I made friends with anybody who illegally had a car on campus, so that I could regularly traverse to New York City and see again more concerts all the time. To me, this is the key. The key is that I went to hear the music. I went to see the music. And around this time, I got interested in jazz only because my listening tastes were very adventurous. And so by 1971 or 72, I had a collection that spanned from Led Zeppelin to Sun Ra, and I had Coltrane, and I had other things, and I was really curious about all these things. And also the fusion music was drawing me, and Mahavishnu and Return to Forever and this kind of thing was attracting my attention as well. And so I did, in fact, go fairly often to see bands of this nature. I remember seeing the first edition of Weather Report in New York at the Beacon Theater. And I saw Larry Coryell a few times play at Slugs. Eventually, when I did find out about Slugs in New York City, then I said, oh, this is a cool place. Not knowing, completely naive to the fact that I was in one of the most dangerous parts of New York City. But I just waltzed into this place at 17 years old. How I even got in the door is beyond me. I have no idea. I said, who's this guy playing? Oh, it's Elvin Jones. I think he's on one of my records. Let me go check him out. And I was, in other words, I was just an adventurer. I was interested in everything. I would go and check things out, and it just got me more and more and more hooked as I went. And then so I decided to go to. I sort of set off on a path that looked like I was going to the Berklee College of Music, and indeed I got accepted and was planning on going. And then I met a lot of very interesting musicians. Before I actually went to the school, I met quite a few interesting musicians in New Haven. And this was the turning point. That's the point that I refer to as 17 years old and when my professional career began, because the people I met were very compelling people. It was a lucky happenstance that I happened to meet them. Anthony Davis, George Lewis, Jay Hogarth, eventually Charles McPherson, Mark Elias, Mark Dresser, Ray Anderson eventually, but via New York because he never lived in New Haven. But all these, and the most important of all was Wadada Leo Smith. He was he and Anthony Davis were the ones that were most, and George, I would have to say, were very influential in my realizing that I had found my home, that this was where I wanted to be, that this is exactly the music that I wanted to be involved in. This made perfect sense to me. Didn't matter that I was a white boy from a suburb and outside of New Haven, Connecticut. This music was all the world to me, and it was nothing but possibility and nothing but things to do, lots of interesting things to explore. And so there I was, suddenly in the music. And I did because I had gotten into the Berklee College of Music, I eventually I just delayed it for a little while, but then I felt compelled to go. And I did go for one semester, but I didn't find it coherently related to how I had figured out music up until that point, which was entirely by autodidactic methods. I had taught myself how to play. I had taught myself everything I knew about music through books, through listening, through a few teachers, but basically I just figured things out on my own, all by ear, all by passion and interest. And going to the college did show me a light about the fact that there was a lot I didn't know, and there was a lot that my autodidacticism was leaving out of the mix. And so I had some holes, let's put it that way, in my education. And that's how I met Alan Dawson, the great master drummer. And eventually, when I spoke with him just before I left Berklee, I arranged to take lessons with him privately, which I did for about 3 years. And all of these things contributed to my being just, I have to say that the one other thing to say about this whole path is that I knew that I loved music and I was doing it, but I was never thinking about where this was going exactly. I had dreams and goals and was slowly achieving some of these things, and they were becoming slowly bigger, and I had greater and greater ideas, and I was kind of following my mates in terms of what they were up to, and Anthony Davis was clearly a composer, and so I composed. And that's how I learned how to compose. I just composed. I didn't know much about it, but I went for it, and I slowly became adept at composition, partly by just doing the process of composition. And what's interesting to me looking backwards is that I didn't, there was no real plan. I just found myself in this community. I found myself loving everything that was going on. I found myself enjoying I had a lot of joy in playing music. There was no question.
Yeah.
It was clear. And this only basically sophisticated itself over time as I slowly gained more tools and became more richly involved in a very wide tapestry of musical curiosities. I became really curious about many kinds of things. Anthony Davis used to say, "You're the most omnivorous listener I've ever met," which means I listened to everything. I really checked out. People would come to me to find out about an obscure Delta blues musician, or the new cutting edge of analog synthesis, or whatever. All these things or wanted to know a lot about Baby Dodds or King Oliver, and I was interested in everything. I was checking it. I was really doing my homework basically by listening to a great deal of music and trying to be well informed about the possibilities of what music could be.
I love that term, omnivore. So let me ask you this. You obviously hit the ground running in the late 70s. You formed the group Bass Drum Bone. And then in 2007, you have a 30th anniversary. What was it like to kind of reconvene and to have that group around for so long?
Well, Bass Drum Bone is a very important part of my story, and it's interesting you raise up the topic of Bass Drum Bone because we are 1 year away from our 40th anniversary. In fact, I should mention that we are involved in quite serious planning about the celebration of that milestone on all of our lives. And I think a fairly rare milestone in jazz in particular. Very few groups that I know of, other than really qualify for being a group that never changed personnel and always maintained such a long history. Of course, it's true, we had dormant periods where all three of us were involved in different things outside of Bass Drum Bone. So in essence, we had this kind of coming away from and then returning to, and coming away from and returning to the group. So we weren't like playing gigs for 40 years every year, but we were nonetheless. We have done. We lost count a long time ago, but hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 gigs together. We've done a lot of concerts over all this time, and have made quite a few CDs as well. And now we take this. You asked about 2007, and that the 30th anniversary was significant. We managed to get a grant from the Chamber Music America, and from Chamber Music America, they supported us on. We actually enlisted ourselves as a band as opposed to an individual, and all three of us made compositions, all of which were released on the last recorded release of ours, which is called The Other Parade. It came out a couple of years after the anniversary, around 2009. The record is as a very good document showing this project as it evolved. It's this kind of thing we have in mind for the 40th anniversary, although we have much bigger plans this time around. We are hoping and working very hard, and I'm sure that with our concerted effort we will achieve a major label release finally for this group, so that we can bring attention to the group to a much wider audience, which has heretofore been more or less, the audience that has followed our work or followed any of our individual work over all these years. What we'd like to see happen is that we have something that, as what is left of the major labels can still provide, which is a high level of visibility and some kind of commercial viability for larger festivals. So the hope is that if we succeed in doing that, and perhaps having a few of our friends as guest artists on this special event CD, then perhaps we'll be able to perform on some of the American festivals throughout the year in 2017, as well as, of course, the European festivals, which is more familiar territory for us. But we would really like to make as many appearances as we can during that year, and all three of us are concentrating on the group as a centerpiece of what we'll be doing next year.
Absolutely. They always say, and it's true, being an artist is kind of a solitary lifestyle to a certain degree. And throughout your career, you've been real prolific with quartets, with Anthony Braxton, Ray Anderson, Herb Robertson, but you've also been very prolific as a soloist since '74. What do you prefer? If you could reach your hand in that magic bag of projects and pull out the ideal slip of paper, would you want to do something on your own, or would you want to team up with some people?
Well, I can't give you an answer that will satisfy the question exactly, because I, like the omnivorous listener, I'm a diverse artist. I'm restless, basically. I'm interested in many things. I'm interested in many platforms or vehicles, if you will, of expression. Solo music is a theme as we look over my whole output over all these years. It's true, you correctly identified the beginning year, 1974, as where I began this road of making solo performances. And ostensibly this was mostly inspired by Wadada Leah Smith, whose solo performances on trumpet and multi-instrumentalist types of things like percussion and so forth was, for me, a big lighthouse. It made a lot of sense to me as a listener. I mean, I went to his performances and I went, I really like this experience of being one-on-one with whom I'm hearing. It's a very special kind of relationship that solo performances give. And I had also, it wasn't the first time I had encountered this, I have some background in classical music, since it's in my family to some degree. My grandmother was a concert pianist, and my father also was involved in composition himself, and so. But via my family, I had experienced a great deal of classical music as I was growing up, and some of that included solo recitals, and so I got to see great virtuosos perform, such as Artur Rubinstein, on stage. And when I saw that, I said, "Wow, that's or a blues singer, a folk singer, just a songwriter, just with he and his guitar." Very powerful stuff. This intimate thing of being one-on-one with a player and a creator of music. I've kept it as a running theme throughout my entire life in music, and the most recent expedition on that front, the CD that is not exactly just a CD, it's a CD and also a DVD, called Kernelings. This project is the 5th production of solo music I've made. And indeed, I continued to make what I took to be the kind of continuation of my thinking as a solo musician. And I should say one other thing about solo music that's I think important and probably interesting to your listeners. For me, the thing that I found interesting about doing solo music, particularly in the sort of earliest stages of it, was that around 1980 or so, I had a lot of time where I had very little gigs. I supported myself with work outside of music, And I very much concentrated. My whole social spectrum of all the musicians I was involved with was kind of, for lack of a better word, fairly dormant in this period. I just didn't have any work. So that's why I took work outside of music in construction and so forth, and supported myself one way or another. But I concentrated. I thought a lot about. I played on my own. I really concentrated on what could I do with this instrument. How could I really elevate this solo music into a different realm? And then I developed what I think could be said to be a very personal vocabulary, or I kind of documented it. I wrote it. I had already been developing it. And that codified into making compositions for my instrument. And that process has unfolded over the years into a fairly nuanced way of looking at the instrument as one might look at a solo piano performance, noting that this instrument has harmonic possibilities, has melodic possibilities, of course it has rhythmic possibilities, and sound and klangfarben, like sound worlds, texture worlds. It has many options. It's very orchestral. It can be very, and so I've done many things. And now in this most recent edition, there is what I take to be some kind of process of distillation going on, which is to say that the pieces that were at one point quite complex and elaborate and highly detailed, fairly thoroughly composed, are now more openly improvised and very simple. Very different feeling coming from me at this point. I'm kind of more, like, it's kind of typical of getting older. You sort of start to see the essence of things in a way. And so I kind of go right to the fundamental thing that I think is most valuable in a musical way, and somehow identify what that is and let use it as a potential launching area for my expression. And then this is coupled with this other aspect of my artistic interest, which has heretofore been undocumented, or at least not released publicly, which is that I've always worked quietly as a visual artist, and always been interested in it, and always been really interested in film. And so the other half of the production is a DVD featuring a long film that is really related to what I'm trying to do as a solo musician, as a solo thinker. But it's also it's just really a sound and image creation that reflects, I think, with the two things together, they're related only in that they show the listener, or the viewer in this case, more about what it is I'm after as an artist in general. The solo things, I have to say, it's a kind of crystallized way of understanding the kind of central aspects of who I am as an artist. It's not to say that I don't. There's another part of me which is about writing tunes, or about singing songs, about all kinds of other things. It's not the only thing, but it does show you the kind of the essence in some way, I think.
Absolutely. Well, the one thing I do want to kind of ask you about, and there's a lot of components to you as an artist and as a musician. In '93, since we're from Kansas City, I want to bring this up. You premiered a commission for the KC Symphony with funding from Meet the Composer, and it was for for terrains. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, that was an outstanding experience on many, many levels. I had been involved previously with the Kansas City Symphony and Bill McLaughlin, who was the conductor at that time, via the person I mentioned very early in my history, Anthony Davis, the composer. He had written some pieces for orchestra that included myself as a soloist and or as an important element that was not exactly part of the orchestra per se, but was integrated into it. And I was either an improvising element, a groove element, whatever. But I formed a function inside of his music that put me inside of an orchestral setting. I also did Anthony's. This wasn't in Kansas City, but I did also his opera work, and I performed 3 or 4 of his operas, and it was wonderful experience as well. And I loved, and it was also tied, I guess, to my own childhood experience with seeing so much orchestral music, which I used to see particularly with my grandmother. I used to sit with her after her husband passed away. I took his chair in Woolsey Hall in New Haven, Connecticut, and witnessed many an incredible symphonic concert. So something about this was a theme of part of who I was. And so I decided to launch into what is typical of me in all of my musical career, is that I kind of like find a challenge, like something I've never done before, and something for which perhaps I don't even have, we could say I don't even have the credential to do. Like, I had never written an orchestral piece or anything like it in my life. But I said, okay, I want to write an orchestral piece. Here I go. Boom, fearlessly jumping into the fire of a complex compositional endeavor. Here's a guy who and it reminds you that I'm completely self-taught when it comes to composition, so I don't have the typical skills that somebody entering into such a serious situation would typically have. So it was a super interesting experience. Not only did I have the opportunity to do this piece with the Kansas City Symphony, but I also had a residency with the symphony. So I was in Kansas City for the first 3 weeks. And then I came back then there was a break for about a month, and then I came back for one final week, at the end of which I did 3 performances with the orchestra in the Symphony Hall. 3 performances of this piece, which was, what a gift! I mean, what an incredible experience. But part of the experience that was interesting for me was of course a huge learning experience for me. The first rehearsal, which happened almost on the day I arrived, I had printed out all my parts, and of course I'm a bit naive about writing orchestral parts. I've never done it before, but I did them all myself, which is of course mistake number 1. And I handed out all these parts to everybody, and at the end of the rehearsal, the music, when I listened to Bill conduct it and go through it, sounded absolutely awful to me. I mean, it sounded like written a complete disaster. The whole thing was and I could see where problems that I could solve were, but I also saw that the whole thing was, I realized, wow, this is a lot harder to write for orchestra. It's like, all I've been writing for up until now was more or less small groups, which is like driving a speedboat compared to a giant ocean freighter, which is the orchestra. So I had a lot to learn. And not only did I have a lot to learn, but the orchestra, which was kind of endearing of them, I have to say, stood in a line at the end of the rehearsal, about 15 to 20 musicians deep, with their parts, and it came up to give me a piece of their mind about what I had shown, what I had done in the part. It was done in a way to try to help me, but it was also like kind of bitching about, well, this is, you can't do this, you can't have this, this is an impossible page turn, you can't, on and on and on. So all these mistakes. So for the next 3 weeks, I labored over the piece, trying to decide what to do to improve it. I was working on it 24/7. I also went to the rehearsals of the Kansas City Symphony, and I sat in the orchestra at rehearsals and listened to what it felt like to be a cellist. Wow. Listened to what it felt like to be the bass clarinet player. The perspective of an orchestra player. I learned so much. I mean, it was invaluable, completely invaluable. And that was the point of the residency, of course. So I came back 3 weeks later with now much, much better parts than I had originally. I kind of took all that criticism and tried to process it. I also had a long discussion with a librarian who explained that it showed me a lot of music. It was a huge learning experience. And I came back and things went considerably better the second time. And finally I began to play, because I was the concerto soloist for the orchestra. But I hadn't played a note on the first rehearsal. I just sat there in horror, listening to this garbage I had written. So the second rehearsal went better, and the only thing that I came back, and I made more improvements between then and when I came back. But then the rehearsal time when I came back was very short, as is typical with orchestras. In fact, I never really had that much time with the orchestra itself. And I learned how efficient I had to be with writing and how quick musicians are, but how little they understand what a new piece of music is about. They have no clue. They're sitting there, they have no idea, they just have to follow the conductor and hope for the best. Yeah. There's no way that they can understand the piece. And I'm not used to this idea that a player of a piece of music doesn't actually grasp what's going on. They're just functioning inside of a machine and trying to and doing exactly what you tell them to do. And I wasn't used to that. So a lot of this was really a very deep understanding of this form of music making, but also a great appreciation for what it's like to be in an orchestra. In the end, the piece was done, and against my wishes, I wanted to make cuts. I wanted to take sections out of the piece, but Bill insisted that I keep the whole piece as it was. And that performance, it was okay. But I would have liked to have taken those sections out. I wasn't happy with it. So 5 years later, I did get another chance to do it again, and this time for a smaller orchestra, and this time with all the cuts and edits and with a lot of time to think about the piece. And then I made what I think is a quite successful piece, about 5 minutes shorter than what I originally had written. And for the Kölner Rundfunk Orchestra in Cologne, Germany. And that performance I'm quite happy with. You can hear a small piece of that performance in this. If you hunt my news page on my website, there's a discussion about a show I did on WKCR, and there's a link to a page that has a streaming of that radio show. And during that radio show, I played many rare recordings that aren't published, including part of that one. So that's a chance to hear what I was just talking about.
Right on. Perfect. The one thing that's kind of reverberate throughout your career is that you've gotten fellowships and grants. Of all of these recognitions you've received, I want to ask you this, not what your favorite one was, but which one did you get that kind of blindsided you? You didn't expect it.
Well, I can't say that was ever true, because I didn't receive what we refer to as prizes. I sought all these grants, meaning I applied to them. In the case of the Guggenheim, which is clearly the most notable acknowledgement I've ever had of my work via a very established and important organization, I applied to the Guggenheim, I think, 7 or 8 times before I actually got the grant. And in the case of Meet the Composer, the grant that allowed me to do this orchestral piece, a huge grant and a very wonderful grant, that my proposal worked, but it was also the efforts of the Kansas City Symphony, which submitted the proposal, that made the whole thing happen. So that was perhaps maybe one of the greater gifts I think I ever had. And what, as you just heard from the story I told, it was a profound experience for me. And on every level, the composer I had a real Meet the Composer experience. It was exactly what they kind of hoped would happen, and it was all a good thing. But like I say, all these grants, and it's true that I did get quite a few of them at a particular time when grants were a little bit more available, and they really helped make it through the drier times of my performance career, and I was able to focus on my composing aspects of my career. They all came with a lot of labor and a lot of effort. Never did I receive something that was like some of the grants that have come up recently, like MacArthur's and things like this nature, where you have it's kind of a huge surprise, and oh wow, I'm acknowledged, how wonderful, or the National Endowment gives you a master's award or whatever. None of this has happened, at least so far. So I can't say I really actually had anything that was blindsided. It was all stuff that I really I made an effort to get, and in some cases I had to make efforts over many, many years to get some of those grants.
So let me ask you this. As an omnivore of music and one that has seen a lot of live shows all over every possible spectrum of music, if you could go back in time and you could witness any musician anywhere, who would you want to see?
Well, I certainly want to see Coltrane, and I certainly want to see Bird. I mean, those are things that everybody wishes they could see if they hadn't had a chance to see them. I felt like I got pretty close to those two musicians because I got to know Elvin. I met Jimmy Garrison. I met McCoy Tyner, and so in some respects, I felt like I I got closer to that. And with Bird, of course, I did meet Philly Joe. I met Art Blakey. I met the drummers, many of the drummers who played with him, Roy Haynes. These are people whom I got to, if not know, I got to at least meet. And to hear them play, of course. So these were things that brought me close to that. But I would really like to go back to New Orleans around 1915 or so, and actually hear what we don't know. That's what I'd like to hear, because that period of time. And I'd also like to hear what happened at the Jenkins Orphanage in South Carolina. I would love to be able to experience it. I would love to have heard Robert Johnson, actually. That would be something I would love to have heard. And I would love to have heard Patsy Cline sing. I'm a big into singers. Singers is really the thing that I'm most taken with. On the listening front of things, it's them that I get the most information from. It's them perhaps I've received the most direct and clear-cut inspiration from. Something about singing just speaks very clearly to me. And I did a record of songs myself, and it's something that I do plan to return to in the future, in the not too distant future. Actually, I am working on it. And these days, I began singing myself as opposed to writing songs for somebody else to sing. And I think I'm finding that voice and understanding what that is for me. And slowly, I think it will materialize into a project. It's just, I'm just working on the craft of it at the moment, doing a lot of study and writing and singing different repertoire from different songwriters I admire. So those are a few people I'd love to have seen. Robert Johnson would be very much on the list, and everything associated with Glenn Blake and Mississippi John Hurt, and a lot of people whom I never got to see. But I did get to see a lot of the blues people when they had the revival in the 60s. Some of that I managed to get to. I did get to see Howlin' Wolf. I did get to see James Cotton. I got to see a lot. I got to see some pretty cool stuff. And I already mentioned all the 60s rock stuff. I saw Cream and their first tour. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah.
It was like really quite an experience to watch that band live. So I feel like I was gifted a great deal with what I did get to see. Of course, with my, as you say, omnivorous taste, I could go on.
Sure.
But I would love to be in that period of New Orleans in particular that is undocumented, because there was nobody wanted to. There's so little that comes, just a few cylinders here and there that goes before 1917. So any time before 1917, and that, I'm so curious to hear the development of this brass playing in terms of how it found itself, how it related itself to blues form, how it emerged out of this ragtime marching feel, and how that inflection began to infuse itself into this rhythm. It's a fascinating period of musical development, and New Orleans must have been quite a place, I have to say, in that time. So it still is in a way, but wow, then it was just something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get to the essence of you as a prolific creator, an educator, visual artist, composer, percussionist. Everybody has their version of who you are. Your family does, your friends do, your business associates, your students. But who do you personally think you are?
I like your succinct questions.
Thank you.
Of course, I wish I could provide such succinct answers. That's just not possible with me. I'm a multi. I have to explain things on several different levels at once.
Sure.
Who am I? It's a great question.
Thank you.
Identity is an aspect that I think is a constantly evolving life experience. I don't think if we think we know who we are, I think it's just an illusion, really, because I think things change and things are never quite the same. If you're really sensitive and paying attention, you begin to notice the changes in the way you feel and think, and your physicality, and all aspects of the way in which you are, how you are as a social being, and how you are alone. I spend, for instance, in this period of my life, I was married all my life, but now I'm I'm single. I'm and living alone, and I spend a lot of time walking in mountains. I swim a lot. I'm in a period of great physical health. I'm in really good physical health, which is a great thing, of course. And I find that that one aspect of who I am is that I so appreciate with such gratefulness that I can't even explain how grateful I am about how amazing the proposition of being on this planet actually is. And I can appreciate it more, perhaps, than I ever did before. And I'm old enough to have a feeling for the limited engagement, as I refer to it, that the being on this planet does entail. We all are only here for a period of time. And when you get to that point in your life, you begin to appreciate details a great deal more. So part of who I am reflects, in terms of my artistry, I think I attempt to reflect in a very honest way through my expression these sentiments of great respect for the planet, great respect for the visit here, and great respect for the joy and possibility of life. And that I realize, one can get a little bit pessimistic inside of being an artist because its economy, at least in the art world that I'm involved in, is well, not so great. To be perfectly blunt,
Sure.
It's just not an easy choice to make, to do the kind of life in music that. It's not a romantic thing at all. It's basically, there's something you're getting from it, and that's why you're doing it. And that thing that I'm getting, if I could summarize it in any way, is that I realize that even though it doesn't affect a grand number of people, it sure be nice if it affected more people and reached out and touched more people than it does at the moment. And perhaps it will someday. But at least what I do understand is that music offers a very, very positive vibration and here's the thing that really strikes me very strongly these days. I go to give a concert, and I'm in the room with whoever it is who shows up. It could be 5 people, 20 people, 200 people, or 1,000 people, and we spend an hour, or perhaps 2 hours if it's a 2-set affair, in this room together. And I offer my expression and my artistry and the most joyous thing that I can offer, and all of us though get to sit in this room and shut the world off for 2 hours and put away the frigging iPhones, whatever the people have. But anyways, everybody gets quiet and have a chance to just be with that positive experience and let it be whatever it's going to be for them. And let it take them wherever it's going to take them. And I think that's kind of huge, particularly in our technologically driven life, and or our world that's full of multiple crises and really difficult situations. To have this moment of basically of peace where this can occur, and that I can offer that really makes it clear that that's my purpose, and that's really what my work is here, and that therefore identifies part of who I am. Does that make sense?
That's beautiful. I love it. I love that answer. That's great. I think that right there was my final question, a real good way of wrapping up your essence. And I want to thank you for taking some time to talk with me today. I appreciate your story, your honesty, and being candid with me about your life.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Gerry for his music, his story, and his warmth. If you would like to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or visit the neonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.